you saw what I'm really capable of, kid.
A river in a dry land, the lessons in a lost hand. When I hope of new beginnings burned our feet, now we needed a habit for demon. Oasis in the siege land, remind us from hero, creating new life, creating rivers in the desert.
You know, there's an art to making a villain character. And much like how you make a rival, there are always good and bad ways on how to do it. They're a key component to a ton of stories. After all, villains often act as the final part of a hero's journey, the final test as it were to see if their journey would actually allow the hero to grow. And there are several different kinds of villains too. Villains, whether they be the absolute lowest of the low, or are characters who have fallen from the light, or maybe you just find the guy to be hot. That's totally a possibility. It's good to be bad. So today I want to look at some of the bad guys of video games and maybe some other media, and look towards the bad and good examples of villains. Spoilers bound for the following games. But first, a sponsor!
You gotta be
Raid Shadow Legends is back again, my friends. Yes, one of the greatest mobile games of all time, Raid Shadow Legends. Raid's got a ton of champions, over 600 now. All those champions come from unique factions, each with their own history in the world of Talaria. And what kind of fantasy world is there without elves? One of my favorite factions is the High Elves. Their backstory is pretty awesome. Their homeland, Aravia, has been around for thousands of years, surviving the fall of the Lizardman Empire, helped the humans form into civilizations, and defeated the orcs when they formed a huge horde and attacked the continent. But then things got twisted when the Siroth, Lord of the Darkness, convinced a bunch of elves to go evil and attack the kingdom. The Civil War nearly ended the elves, but Aravia survived, rebuilt, and is now stronger than ever. Absolutely awesome. And my favorite champion is Vergus. He looks extremely cool. Have you seen that helmet? I want one too. And this month is huge for Raid. They just released a brand new faction, the Sylvan Watchers, with some amazing new champions. Forest Elves, Ents, Druids, Fays, they're all here, and I can't wait to summon them all to play with. And if that's not enough, Raid's got a full lineup of events, along with a new season of the Forge Pass, where you can get your hands on some of the most powerful gear the game has ever seen. Also, if you're an Amazon Prime member, you can get your exclusive rewards in Raid right now. This is the best time to get started in Raid, and if you click my link in the description or scan my QR code here on the screen, you'll get unique bonuses worth $30. We're talking a free epic champion, Vergus, 200,000 silver, 1 energy refill, 1 XP boost, and 1 ancient shard so you can summon awesome champions as soon as you get in-game. All this treasure will be waiting for you here, and it's that easy. Just click the link in the description and I'll see you in the game. Thanks again to Raid Shadow Legends for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to the actual video.
Everything beautiful should stay that way.
Shock of all shocks, we're starting this video with a Pokemon example, because I like to think that Pokemon as a series does have good villains, but they just tend to have some issues. Like, I can appreciate the evil teams aspect, but as it were, it does get tiresome. It's really the leaders of the evil team that tend to stand out more as characters. Like, you've got Getsis, who want to take over the world by ridding people of their Pokemon while he had his, and had his whole abusive relationship with N to work with to make him a scummy villain. Or Cyrus, a guy who was so entrenched in nihilism and loneliness that he wanted to remake the entire world because he was more focused on logic than actual emotions. But now we get to Lysandre.
You were chosen to be a movie star, correct? Isn't it your duty to be ever beautiful? Everything beautiful should stay that way forever. I would end the world in an instant so that beauty never fades.
There's recently been a resurgence of Pokemon X and Y love at the moment. It's called the Pokemon Cycle, where people suddenly act like certain generations that had good elements were bad at the time, but in retrospect are really good, and vice versa. This happened with Black and White, games that were criticized for changing a lot of the formula, and it's now happening with X and Y. X and Y are my personally least favorite games in the series, above BDSP, so I got a bit of a bias here. But since when has bias ever stopped me before? We're talking about villains, therefore we're talking about Lysandre. He's the leader of Team Flare, a wealthy businessman, and one of the weakest villains in Pokemon in my humble opinion. Now, I think that X and Y have some issues with its writing, and Lysandre is probably emblematic of it, which is a shame because the idea of Lysandre's story is a tale of sorrow, misanthropy, and how human greed can drive a person to madness. For those who aren't familiar with Lysandre, he's actually pretty similar to Cyrus of Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, but with some very key differences. Lysandre has good intentions as he wants to preserve the beautiful world he lives in, and wants to save it from foolish humans who exploit our world and other people, even if he has to destroy the current world to do it. The tragic part of Lysandre is that he was originally a businessman who wanted to help as many people as he could, but his views were quickly shifted when people kept throwing up walls to stop him, or those who he helped turned out to be very unsavory characters. To boil it down, he's a man who has the power to help the world but can't be helping because of greed in others. That's not a bad motivation for a guy to fall into the dark side and want to achieve his goals. The problem lies in X and Y's writing. Like, one of the first lines you ever get from Lysandre, and I believe it's before it's revealed he's the leader, he says, unprompted, "My desire is for a more beautiful world." Like, the execution of Lysandre is the issue here. You got a very deep and tragic character motif going on here, but he comes off as a manic, crazy guy.
It's for the benefit of Kalos and the world. You must put your trust in me.
If only I could wipe away the impurities.
I halfway expected to see the guy dressed in a sandwich board on the sidewalk ranting and raving about how the end is nigh with how he's written. A little subtlety would be appreciative, which, considering that this is Pokemon, yeah, his design doesn't help either. Let's take N for a counterexample. Now, he's the king of Team Plasma, but you wouldn't know that looking at him. And this is due to color theory, and the addition of the massive amount of green in his hair and his surprisingly mundane attire works well to think that he's just a weird kid who seems to agree with Team Plasma, which was something that, back in those games, wasn't actually uncommon. Lysandre, on the other hand, well, his fiery red hair and black suit hold similar elements to the evil team. It just screams, "Hey, I'm part of Team Flare!" And speaking of, let's talk about Team Flare now. I get their motive for global genocide, but why do they need to steal fossils or siphon energy from the power plant? They got Lysandre, the head of the most powerful corporation of all Kalos. Is he not able to provide the support, the team, and goal that he wants to do so? Or is it because of those greedy assholes again? Again, it's a lack of actual subtlety in how am I supposed to take his character and his team seriously, even more so when Team Flare was essentially failing every time. They were a non-threat until the climax of the story, not help that they were essentially all flair and no substance. Let's make another comparison concerning teams. Team Skull. A lot of the encounters you had with Team Skull had a fun spin to them and had a lot of character, especially with the grunts. We learn also that they aren't supposed to be taken seriously, but in a good way, funnily enough, since we learn they're just a bunch of rebellious teenagers that are trying to be too hard to be gangsta. God, I sounded more white than I ever wanted to be. And then there's Guzma, a guy who was a bit of a failure with no real future after he failed the Alolan Island Challenge and created a group for others who felt the same. There's also the theory that he got beat by a golf club by his dad, but I'm not sure if that's true or not, but whatever. Like, if you want to talk sympathy for a villain, Guzma's the way to go. He ended up being very sympathetic, especially when he has the head for insecure and depressed misfits. Unlike other villains, it was obviously he still had a heart despite his implied abuse. He gave his grunts and Gladion a place to belong and never saw them as mooks, and thinks the world of his Pokemon. Lysandre had a good motive, but the execution was the issue, and depending on which version of the game you played, his plan made no sense. Then again, a lot of people will probably argue that Pokemon villains are all bad. We live in that kind of world nowadays, folks. Drink it all in.
I see. You came to punish me then. What a pity.
SEYMOUR!
You know, I don't really talk about Final Fantasy that much on my channel, which is a shame because I grew up on the series as well as Pokemon. And for better or worse, I feel like the series has kind of run its course. I still enjoy going back to the series, and hey, I can appreciate the games have been released or remade. Again. Point is, I just fell off the boat with Final Fantasy Hallway. So, you may be wondering why I choose Seymour Guado. You know, I feel like I should be censored for saying that for some reason.
Why are you still here, sir? I beg your pardon. We Guado are keen to the scent of the far plane.
Seymour, to me, tends to be an interesting villain, and we're not just talking about the weird hairstyle that he's got going on. You see, in Final Fantasy X, for those who aren't really familiar with the game, there's a giant monster named Sin who attacks and destroys a lot of places in the land of Spira. Seymour's goal is ultimately become the new Sin, and, well...
He has been granted sleep eternal. Death is a sweet slumber. All the pain of life is gently swept away. Ah, yes. So you see, if all life were to end in Spira, all suffering would end. Don't you see? With death on our side, we will save Spira. And for this, I will take from you your strength, Yuna, your life, and become the next Sin. I will destroy Spira. I will save it.
I mean, he ain't wrong. If everyone's dead, suffering would end. Now, this just sounds like evil, mustache-twirling mumbo-jumbo, at least on the surface level, especially if you're like, I don't know, 13 years old at the time when this game came out, but it's actually kind of interesting when you take into consideration that Seymour is almost like a polar opposite to one of the leads of the game, Yuna. Yuna is a character who wants to save the world from sin, even at the expense of her own life. She represents hope, if you will.
Yuna won't stop dancing. Not until sin is gone.
Meanwhile, you've got Seymour, who's essentially a nihilist, the rejection of all religious and moral principles in the belief that life is meaningless. And it really works if you think about it. Throw in the fact that Seymour is a recurring villain throughout the story, it really allows the players to fight against his nihilism. You fight him at least 4 different times, and each time his form changes, as a bit of a significance as to how he's becoming less and less human/Guado. Also, side note, I still love how Seymour uses anima. Like, you can't tell me that him summoning this demonic creature in the stadium wasn't awesome. Especially with that giant chain smashing into the ground and yanking this living nightmare from hell itself up to blast demons. Now, there are issues with Seymour as a character. I personally think having to fight the guy 4 times is a bit much. Like, it gets on a little edge of Team Rocket's level of absurdity. I say this because Seymour is dead! A little context is needed, I see. The dead in Final Fantasy X can remain on the living plane due to their regrets, anger, and negativity, and will warp into monsters unless they are sent to the afterlife. I say this is kinda dumb because Yuna can perform the sending ritual, and a good portion of the time she, doesn't.
You are wise.
Like, what's stopping the party from stopping the guys dragging Seymour away and sending the nihilist to hell? But that's more or less me griping about the writing. Nah. There's a bigger issue with Seymour as a villain, and that's he's the villain that you're exposed to the most. Like, you've got Sin, but he's more or less a force of nature. Seymour is more personable of a villain, and allows you to at the very least understand his mindset, even if you just think he's a nutbar with a genocide fetish and a near infinite amount of hair gel. The main problem is that he isn't the final villain of the game, and instead...
I know it's selfish, but this is my story.
Yeah. Like, this thing is the cause of sin. Yu Yevon. I can't even call him a villain. Hell, I can't even call him a boss fight since he's so pathetic. He doesn't attack you, he heals you. Like, I understand there's a symbolic meaning to this boss fight that's going over my head right now, but for something that has the ability to corrupt and mutate creatures into the monstrous entity of sin, it's really kind of pathetic, especially since in comparison to the other characters that should have been the final villain, this just really leaves a bad taste in my mouth. I get that it's cleanup, but it seems really unnecessary. Take Sin, aka Jet. The main character's Titus' father, who was a very kick-ass battle that could have wrapped up the story nicely since it's the emotional climax of Titus' father issues with Jet. While I was doing some research for this section, I saw a lot of people saying that Yu Yevon being pathetic was the point, and that it's a symbolic fight of how you're just wrapping up the story. The fact that you start the fight by having the aeons you go through the story get corrupted and you have to kill them, yeah, I get that. I even saw people saying that Yu Yevon being pathetic and disappointing is kind of the point of his character. To me, I don't think that's an actual defense. Just because there's a reason for something, that doesn't mean that people have to like it, or if they think so, that doesn't mean it was done well. I even saw a Reddit post where someone called Yu Yevon as a reward for beating Jet. I don't know, I don't feel like a god when I step on an ant. I'd feel like a god if I can omni-slash the bastard who was the cause of all the suffering throughout the story. At least there, you still got to fight Sephiroth in an actual battle before you get this cinematic end part right here. Villains, to me, or the best villains, are the kind that you can interact with, that you can see into their mindset, that the characters you play have a connection to. It makes it all the more satisfying and emotionally staggering that way to me. Seymour was a narratively imposing villain to the leads of the game, and Jet was an emotionally tied character to Titus. Or is it Titus? I don't know anymore. Yu Yevon is a tick. I'm not saying that the man behind the curtain can't work. Hell, let's talk about a good example with that.
My source is I made it the fuck up.
Gotta round out the year with at least one more Metal Gear Rising reference, and what better way than to talk about the big bad of the game?
Making the mother of all omelets here, Jack. Can't fret over every egg.
Senator Armstrong. Now this is how you do a villain behind the curtain. Before the famous scene with him, we're only exposed to Armstrong once, and it was technically a flashback of sorts. We're really only given the chance to see him in his second scene, and when he does, Armstrong really makes the scene his own. What with his overtop actions and interaction with Raiden.
Even war. Especially war. Bullshit! The Patriots planted the seed. We don't need them around to filter and foster their memes any longer. We're spreading them just fine ourselves. Every American man, woman, and child. We're all sons of the Patriots now!
No thanks, bro.
Like, this hammy performance is really attention-grabbing for a villain who essentially appears at the last second, and the fact that he's on top of a giant robot that you fight just adds to the grandeur of the character. This won't be for every villain in the world, but introductions and confrontations are extremely important to do, and you need to at least have the villains have some sort of impact if you're going to have them be the blatant villain of the story. Like, to get from Armstrong, for example, let's talk about introductions. So, how about Girahim from Skyward Sword? For a scene that doesn't have voice acting, Girahim does leave a lasting impression on the player with how close he gets to Link, his choice of dialogue, and the weird tongue lashing cement his character. It's the performance that really cements that these two are for the players and how they interact with the protagonists that make them stick out. And this is probably a preference on my end, but I like to think that villains need to actually interact with the heroes. They tend to be the stronger villains since they actually put themselves in the forefront.
I think that one was about to say, I love you.
It doesn't hurt that Armstrong is also a very entertaining villain.
Don't fuck with this, Senator!
Now, I don't want to go too deep into Armstrong as a character, a boss fight and his symbology, since I've already dedicated an entire video to the guy earlier this year, which I'll put in the description and in the card above, but I feel like he represents a necessary flair that villains need, especially in today's modern environment. You have to remember that we're enjoying a piece of media, and while I'm not saying every villain needs to be a giant ham, they need to be memorable, and they need to be interacted with, either through the gameplay or through cutscenes.
Don't get cocky, you little shit!
It's kind of why I don't like Yu Yevon. He just pretty much comes out of nowhere. We only get told about him beforehand, and then giant tick. Meanwhile, Armstrong, we get a scene with him pretty much being a regular politician, and then all of a sudden he's kicking your ass on top of a giant robot. Part of the reason why I think Armstrong is such an effective villain despite his low amount of screen time is because of how he just steals the show. And then the fact he's got a kick-ass boss theme. Speaking of, he's also a very effective boss fight, and acts as a good parallel to Raiden, or even a warning to him that he is something that Raiden could become one day. Heck, the fact that Armstrong dies in a pose that resembles Raiden's shadow kind of makes that implication. That's another reason why I think Armstrong is an effective villain. He acts as a counter to Raiden. Even the song that is playing during when you fight him alludes to that. Both Armstrong and Raiden essentially want to fix the world, and they both made compromises to do so, spilling countless amounts of blood in the process. They're similar, yet at the same time opposing forces. Plus, Armstrong is so much of a bastard that while he is entertaining, you still want to kill him for wanting to scoop kids' brains out and turn them into super soldiers. It's a good balance of enjoying him as a character, but still realizing that he is a bad guy. And it's satisfying to defeat him in a boss fight, too.
No way! I can't believe this!
Unlike my rival video, I'm not going to end this one on who I think is the best villain in all of video games.
Oh, good. Why, that's very good.
Rather, I want to talk about a classic villain and one who's kind of evolved over the years, and not just in design. Dr. Robotnik, aka Eggman, has a number of games he's in, and while in other earlier games he was just your generic bad guy who had the ability to turn living creatures into his robotic slaves, he has become a bit more entertaining.
Attention guests, if you can hear this message, you are trespassing in an area still under renovation. If you are not a robot, please return to the main park areas and ignore anything evil you might have seen here. Thank you.
I could go on the whole industrial angle that Eggman represented, that he represented the industrialization and how man's greed will ravage the world if we're not careful, and how Sonic the Hedgehog represented nature itself. I mean, I'm probably reading a bit too much into it, especially since it seems to have dropped that aspect into the more modern games, but I like to think that as the games got flashier, included things like dialogue and more characterization, it allowed the Sonic games to at least attempt at some interesting development for its cast.
Chaos control!
I said attempt, didn't I? Regardless, I do think that there was some depth given to the good doctor in some games. Two in particular that I do want to bring up in this video are Sonic Adventure 2 and the latest game, Sonic Frontiers. Let's start with Classic Adventure 2, shall we?
Going up!
During that game, we actually get some motivation and some interesting arm movements from the good doctor.
Okay, I got all of it on the Twitter. I'm gonna see what's up. Okay, everybody, shut up.
But more importantly, we learn about Eggman's past since we learn about his family.
As a child, I looked up to my grandfather because of all the great things he accomplished in his life. He was my hero, and I wanted to be a great scientist like him. But did he really mean to destroy us?
I don't know, but what I do know is all's well that ends well, right?
Also, don't get on my case with the audio. That's literally how the game is with the English version. But in any case, we learn that Eggman wanted to be a great scientist just like his grandfather, and he's shocked that his grandfather wanted to destroy the entire world. This to me is also an element to villains that you need to have: humanization. You need to show them having multiple aspects to them, and not just be a flat I'm evil. Now, I'm not saying that one-note villains, where they're just evil for the sake of evil, aren't entertaining or are bad, but when you're really trying to have your villains be more like characters, it's kind of necessary. It allows the audience to connect with them. It's more apparent in the latest game, Sonic Frontiers, which, yes, I'm trying to get some steam from talking about it, but I still maintain that it's a good example of Eggman becoming more of a character as well, especially when we're introduced to Eggman's quote-unquote daughter, Sage.
Keep up the good work, Sage.
Thank you, Doctor.
She's an artificial intelligence, and it's through her that we learn some more stuff about the Doctor, like how he actually has a begrudging respect for the Hedgehog.
I can confirm Sonic has made multiple breaches into cyberspace and escaped.
Through raw talent and no shortage of tenacity, I'm sure. Impressive.
You speak of him with respect as often as you curse him. I do not understand.
Oh, I hate that hedgehog. That doesn't change the fact that he is a formidable adversary. I respect him. I don't have to like him.
We also get a bit more into Eggman on a human level, as throughout the game we see a few times how he grows closer to Sage in a father-daughter relationship.
I'll integrate you into my system, give you control of the whole Eggnet. I'll have you network all my robots. You'll be a refreshing change of pace from Orbot and Cubot.
They are your creations, like me. That would make them like my brothers?
I suppose so.
I look forward to that.
It's not the deepest characterization, but Eggman does genuinely consider her to be his daughter, even to the point where she actually talks him into working with Sonic.
This is our chance. I never simulated a scenario where Sonic helped, since you never authorized it.
I still don't want to!
Please.
Sonic, I hereby induct you into the Eggman Empire in order you to save us all. Understand? This is not an alliance.
Even if it's done in the most tsundere way possible. Of course, as the game goes forward, Sage sacrifices herself for the
Shut it!
and retreated to this scene after the story is done.
Father?
That's my girl.
I've said this before, I'm a sucker for father stuff, so maybe this is my own bias talking, but I think this was a really good direction to take Eggman as a character and villain. It humanizes him and really makes him not only into just an antagonist to fight against the too cool for school hedgehog, but it makes him into an interesting character. There's also additional information about Eggman in the Egg Memos. Stuff like Eggman talking about Sage and referring to her as her.
She's the best. It's a program. An adorable program, a very personable program. I wonder if she has a preference.
And then talking about his cousin Maria, the girl who was killed in Shadow's backstory.
I never really knew my cousin Maria. Everyone spoke of her like she was very special. All that love for someone who was gone when I was right there. But I have to wonder, back then, was she anything like Sage is now?
There's a lot of good stuff for Eggman in Frontiers, and I think it's for the better to make him more of a dynamic character and villain. And sure, I can bring up other iterations like Robotnik from Sad AM.
Oh, that's good. That's very good indeed.
Or the movies.
Back to the days of tipping cows and being in a drug band.
Or Boom.
Is this a towel?
What am I supposed to cover with that? Are you making fun of me?
Or him as a character in the IDW comics, which apparently might be canon now thanks to this game.
I bet Tangle would love climbing around these ruins.
What? But I think to talk about Eggman as a full-on character and all his iterations, that would require an entire video to go over him and his history, and I don't know if I'm the right guy for that job, actually. Still, I believe Eggman is at the very least an interesting villain, has gotten some interesting characterization going on. I honestly look forward to his next appearance and how things will go from this. I'm not the biggest Sonic fan, but I can appreciate this kind of characterization for a character who was just essentially just like a big round ball that ran faster than Sonic, apparently.
Call it.
You know, there's such a vast catalog of villains in our modern day culture, and frankly this video has barely scratched the surface of them. Even if I just limit my scope to video games, there are a ton of characters that should be talked about because, unlike a lot of people, I do think there are good villains in our media. Especially video games. And just like there are countless villains, there are near countless ways to write villains. Some good, others bad. Hell, I still want to talk about villains in the Yakuza games, since they themselves are some of the most fascinating aspects of those titles. Or maybe even branch outside the realm of video games to talk about villains in anime or movies. Like, I'm gonna be honest, part of me really want to talk about Hisoka from Hunter x Hunter in this video because I find him not only be a creepy character, but also a villain that, while not having a lot of death because he essentially has a fighting fetish, he has these creepy undertones to him while being entertaining at times as well. So I want to see what you guys think, and if we manage to get over 10k likes, I'll gladly make another video about villains. Maybe a specific archetype of villains, who knows? And if that's the case, I'd love to hear what you guys think is a good villain for me to talk about. Or what you think a bad villain is. Even if it's just a silly villain or a serious one, I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. And if you can't think of a comment, maybe just say, Lysandre! Just let me know how far you got into the video. I'm MangaKamen, and thanks for watching. See you guys in the next one.